erased from history, sealed for centuries, never meant to be seen again. Imagine this, a cracked stone tablet buried beneath desert sand, its symbols still glowing faintly, as if the words themselves refused to sleep. Tonight you have found what they tried to destroy. A book so ancient, so dangerous that empires banned it. Priests cursed it and entire councils voted to erase its name from sacred record. What if the story of fallen angels was never myth, but memory? Somewhere between heaven and ruin, between prophecy and cyberspace, a man named Enoch walked with forces older than civilization itself and wrote down everything he witnessed. The air grows heavier now. The darkness leans closer. This is the Book of Enoch, the lost scripture they tried to erase. Stay with me. There is a room somewhere beneath the weight of forgotten centuries where the air does not move and the dust has not been disturbed in a very long time. The shelves there hold no ordinary texts. They hold the kind of knowledge that empires once decided humanity was not permitted to keep words pressed into parchment by hands that had seen things no living scholar has been allowed to verify, transcribed in the trembling hours before dawn, by those who understood with terrible clarity that what they were writing down would one day be taken from them. The Book of Enoch is one of those texts. It is not simply an old religious document filed under apocrypha and quietly forgotten. It is a record of meticulous, layered, and deeply strange of what a single man claimed to have witnessed when the boundary between the visible world and something far older than civilization itself became for a brief and terrifying moment permeable. And what makes it remarkable is not only what it contains, but what was done to ensure that most of humanity would never read it. For over 1,000 years, this text was considered lost. It had been cherished by the earliest Christian communities, quoted directly by the Apostle Jude, as if its authority were beyond question, referenced in the silent margins of manuscripts that scholars have since been very careful not to discuss too loudly. Jesus and his disciples moved through a world in which the words of Enoch were known, circulated, weighted with meaning, and then quietly, deliberately, and with the kind of institutional precision that leaves very few fingerprints, it was removed, banned, cursed in some records, sealed away in the kind of archives that do not appear on public catalogues, and whose doors it is said open only from the inside. The man who would eventually bring it back was a Scottish traveller named James Bruce, and when he returned from Ethiopia in 1773, carrying 3 copies of a text that Western scholars had declared extinct, the response from the academic establishment was not celebration. It was suspicion. It was delay. It was the particular kind of reluctant acknowledgement that institutions produce when something surfaces that they had very good reasons for hoping would remain buried. The manuscript sat. It was studied slowly, cautiously, as if those doing the studying feared what full translation might confirm. And when the translation came, it confirmed everything that certain powerful structures had spent centuries trying to ensure would remain unspoken. What Enoch describes and what you are now drifting toward, traveller, as the weight of this hour settles gently across your shoulders is nothing less than the original account of a catastrophe. Not a natural one, not a mythological one in the dismissive sense that word has come to carry. A catastrophe with names, with ranks, with a precise account of what was taught by whom, and what the consequences of that teaching were for a civilization that had no framework within which to process what was happening to it. 200 beings descended. The text gives the number with the kind of specificity that myths rarely bother with. It gives their leader's name. It gives the mountain where they landed Hermon in the days of Jared, and it records that they swore an oath to one another before they came down, as if they knew what they were doing was forbidden, and chose to do it anyway. What they brought with them was knowledge. And this is where the story becomes strange in a way that no institutional archive has ever satisfactorily explained, because what they taught was not primitive magic or crude superstition. It was metallurgy, astronomy, the reading of celestial signs, the knowledge of roots and plants and their uses, the art of working metals into weapons and ornaments, the understanding of the movements of the moon and the course of the stars. These are not the gifts of darkness. These are the foundations of civilization itself. And the question that the Book of Enoch forces the careful reader to sit with quietly in the late hours with the lamp burning low is this: if these beings were cast as demons by the institutions that followed, what does that tell us about how those institutions regarded the knowledge they carried? The answer is buried somewhere in the silence between the official records. It lives in the ink-stained notes of scholars who got too close to the question and were reassigned in the manuscripts that were confiscated before translation could be completed in the names that were scratched from stone in the centuries after the great councils decided which texts would survive and which would not. History was rewritten, but not erased, because the Book of Enoch survived. Because you are here now in the quiet dark listening. Because some truths are simply too deeply carved into the foundations of the world to be fully removed no matter how many centuries of institutional pressure are applied to the task of their disappearance. Somewhere beneath the ruins of what we call the ancient world, something still waits to be correctly understood. The words of Enoch are one doorway into that understanding, slow, difficult, demanding patience and a willingness to sit with mystery rather than demand that it immediately resolve. And so tonight, as the silence presses gently along the stone corridors of whatever room you find yourself in, allow yourself simply to listen. The record is long, the night is deep, and what comes next, the full account of what Enoch saw, what was revealed to him, and what was done to ensure that revelation would not survive, is only beginning to surface from the dark. Sleep now, traveller, the past will keep watch. There is a particular kind of subordinates that accumulates in rooms where forbidden documents have been studied, a silence that is not merely the absence of sound, but something thicker, something that carries the residue of every careful hand that has turned these pages in the dark, every scholar who has leaned close to the lamp and understood with a cold clarity that what they were reading was not supposed to exist. The evidence left behind by the Book of Enoch is not the evidence of mythology. It is the evidence of a record systematic cross-reference corroborated by fragments found in manuscripts separated by centuries and continents, and it points in a direction that the official histories of both religion and archaeology have found extremely inconvenient to follow. The first thing the careful observer notices when reading the earliest chapters of Enoch, without the filtering lens of institutional interpretation, is that the text is organized with a precision that does not belong to the realm of poetic invention. The watchers are numbered. Their leaders are named individually, 20 of them listed with the kind of administrative specificity that suggests not a storyteller embroidering myth, but a chronicler recording an event that had already been documented somewhere else before the words reached this page. Samjaza is named as their leader. His associates are named in rank. The mountain of their descent is identified by location and by the etymology of its name, which the text itself pauses to explain. They called it Hermon because of the oath sworn upon it, the mutual imprecation that bound them to a course of action they understood to be transgressive before they took it. This level of detail is not what myths produce. Myths round their edges. They generalize. They speak of gods and heroes in the sweeping language of archetype rather than the precise language of record. What Enoch provides is something closer to a deposition, a careful sequential account of events that includes not only what happened, but why and what the institutional response to that happening was when the archangels who observed it brought their report before what the text calls the Lord of the Ages. The response was not surprise. The response was a series of specific commands, each directed to a specific archangel, each addressing a specific aspect of the catastrophe. Uriel was sent to Noah. Raphael was sent to bind Azazel. Gabriel was sent against the offspring. Michael was sent to bind Samjaza and his associates. The precision of this administrative response implies the existence of a system, a structure of accountability and consequence that was already in place before the transgression occurred, which in turn implies that the transgression was not the first of its kind. What the text buried inside these clinical instructions, and what the scholars who later recommended its removal from the canon understood with uncomfortable clarity as a direct challenge to the narrative of human development that every subsequent civilization has built its authority upon. If the knowledge that defines civilization, metallurgy, astronomy, the reading of celestial signs, the working of precious stones, the understanding of medicinal plants was transmitted to humanity not through gradual indigenous discovery, but through deliberate instruction by beings who descended from somewhere else, then the institutions that claim authority over that knowledge are built on a foundation they did not lay. The church that banned this book understood what it contained. The councils that debated its exclusion were not debating theology, they were debating power. They were deciding with the calm deliberation of those who hold the archives which version of the past would be permitted to inform the present. The evidence of this deliberation is visible for those who look in the margins of the text that survived. The Book of Enoch is quoted in the Epistle of Jude with the easy familiarity of a document considered authoritative. It is echoed in the language of the New Testament, in passages that make far more sense when read alongside the Enochic source material. It is referenced in the writings of the earliest church fathers, Tertullian, Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, as a legitimate prophetic document before the councils of the 4th and 5th centuries quietly began reclassifying it as problematic, then apocryphal, then heretical. The trail of its suppression is a trail of institutional fingerprints left on the margins of history, and those fingerprints tell a story that the official record was never designed to accommodate. There are scholars who have spent careers in the late-night corridors of theological archives pulling manuscripts that have not been catalogued in living memory finding. In the cross-references between texts, a pattern that the surface history obscures, they find the same names recurring. They find the same astronomical knowledge embedded in traditions separated by oceans. They find the same account of a catastrophic interference told in different languages, clothed in different mythological frameworks, but pointing with remarkable consistency toward the same series of events that the Book of Enoch describes in the kind of plain sequential language that suggests its author was not constructing allegory, but attempting to faithfully transmit something he had either witnessed or received from a source he considered unimpeachable. The dust on those manuscripts is very old, the silence around them is very deep, and the evidence they contain for those patient enough to sit with it in the long quiet hours of the night has never been successfully refuted, only buried, reclassified, and sealed behind doors whose existence is not acknowledged in the public record. Yet the record does not end there. What surfaces next as the text descends deeper into its account of what the watchers brought and what was done in response is stranger and more unsettling still. There is a particular moment in the study of forbidden history when the anomalies stop feeling like exceptions and begin to feel like evidence, when the accumulation of things that should not exist, things that do not fit the accepted timeline, things that have been quietly removed from public-facing scholarship reaches a density that can no longer be explained by coincidence or academic oversight. The Book of Enoch produces that moment early, and it produces it in a way that is deeply uncomfortable for anyone who has spent time examining the official record of human development, because what the text describes embedded within its precise, almost clinical language is a pattern of interference that leaves marks on history which have never been fully explained away, only reclassified into categories designed to discourage further inquiry. Consider what Azazel is recorded as having taught. The text is specific in a way that demands attention. The making of swords and knives and shields and breastplates, the working of metals, the use of antimony, the beautifying of the eyelids with colouring tinctures, the knowledge of precious stones and their properties. This is not the curriculum of a demon in any recognisable theological sense. This is the curriculum of an advanced teacher transmitting technical knowledge to a population that, according to the conventional archaeological timeline, should not yet have possessed the cognitive or material infrastructure to receive it. The metallurgical knowledge encoded in the Enochic account corresponds with striking precision to transitions in the archaeological record that have long puzzled researchers, sudden appearances of sophisticated metalworking in cultures that show no developmental precursor advanced astronomical knowledge, embedded in monument alignments that required observational data accumulated over centuries before the civilization in question is supposed to have existed, written systems that appear without the rough early stages that every theory of indigenous development predicts should be visible in the ground. The anomaly is not that these things exist in the archaeological record. The anomaly is that the institutions responsible for interpreting that record have developed over several centuries a remarkable collective instinct for not connecting them to the textual tradition that describes their origin. Enoch names the teachers. The ground preserves the lessons. And the space between those two facts, the textual account and the physical evidence, has been maintained as an uncrossable boundary by a scholarship that is in the most literal sense institutionally funded to keep it uncrossed. There are careers built on the maintenance of that boundary. There are entire academic departments whose continued existence depends on the conventional narrative remaining undisturbed. And there are archives, some within institutions, whose public face presents an image of open inquiry, where the documents that would most directly challenge that narrative have been held in conditions of access so restricted that the majority of scholars who might examine them have spent their entire professional lives unaware of their existence. What the Book of Enoch preserves beneath the theological language that was itself a product of the cultural framework within which it was transmitted is something that functions less like mythology and more like an incident report. a careful sequential account of a specific event whose consequences were so significant that multiple independent traditions across multiple continents developed their own versions of the same narrative told in different languages, clothed in different symbolic system, but carrying at their core the same anomalous claim that the knowledge which defines human civilization did not emerge from within humanity, and that the beings who transmitted it were subsequently reclassified by the institutions that inherited that knowledge and built their authority upon it as something dangerous, fallen, and forbidden to speak of directly. The reclassification was not theological in its origin, it was political. It was the kind of decision that gets made in rooms where the long-term management of institutional power is the primary concern and where the survival of a particular narrative about human origins is understood to be inseparable from the survival of the authority structure that the narrative supports. The archangels in the text that understand this. When Michael speaks to Raphael about the judgment of the Watchers, there is in his language the weight of an administrative reckoning, a settling of accounts that has been delayed precisely because the full consequences of what the Watchers taught have not yet worked themselves through the system. The earth, the text says, has been corrupted through the works that were taught by Azazel. To him ascribe all sin. This is a remarkable statement. It is not the language of mythology attributing evil to a symbolic figure. It is the language of an inquiry determining institutional responsibility, identifying the point of origin of a systemic failure that has propagated through human culture in ways that were at the time of the text's composition still visibly unfolding. The inquiry is ongoing. The consequences are still being felt, and the record of that inquiry, preserved in a document that spent over 1,000 years classified as lost, is available now to anyone patient enough to sit with it in the long quiet hours when the noise of the official narrative has finally subsided enough to allow something older and stranger to be heard. The silence that surrounds this chapter of the text is not the silence of absence. It is the silence of deliberate suppression, the particular quality of stillness that accumulates in corridors where documents have been removed, where names have been scratched from stone, where catalogues have been edited, with the same careful hand that edits all official records, when the truth they contain becomes structurally inconvenient. Somewhere beneath the weight of that silence the anomaly persists. The evidence remains in the ground. The names are still carved, however faintly, in the oldest available sources, and what the text reveals next, descending further into the account of what followed the descent, what was built, what was destroyed, and what was preserved, carries with it the particular gravity of something that was never meant to surface. But that was only the beginning. There is a specific quality of silence that surrounds the things that were deliberately removed from history, a silence that is not natural, not the silence of things that were never known, but the manufactured silence of things that were known very well, and then through the application of sustained institutional pressure made to seem as though they had never existed at all. It is a silence with edges. It is a silence that if you press against it carefully in the late hours, when the official narratives have quieted enough to allow for genuine inquiry, yields the faint outline of something that was once very loud indeed, something that echoed across the ancient world with sufficient force to demand a coordinated suppression lasting more than a millennium. The silence around the Book of Enoch is precisely that kind of silence, and its shape tells us as much about what was removed as the text itself tells us about what happened. The mechanics of that suppression are worth examining slowly, because they reveal a pattern of institutional behaviour that recurs throughout the histories of forbidden knowledge with remarkable consistency. It begins not with outright destruction that is too visible, too easily documented by the very scholars whose work the institution needs to maintain its credibility, but with reclassification. The text is moved from the category of scripture to the category of apocrypha. The word itself is instructive apocrypha from the Greek meaning hidden away, not false, not disproven, simply hidden, placed beyond the reach of ordinary inquiry, reclassified into a category whose definition carries the implicit suggestion that what it contains is either too complex for general consumption or insufficiently verified for authoritative use. The reclassification is the first layer of silence. It does not destroy the record. It simply ensures that the majority of those who might consult the record will have been long before they reach it conditioned to approach it with skepticism rather than open attention. The second layer is the layer of discrediting scholarship. When James Bruce returned from Ethiopia in 1773, carrying the copies of Enoch that would eventually reach Richard Lawrence and produce the first modern English translation, the academic establishment did not engage with the text seriously for decades. The delay was not procedural, it was strategic, because the moment the text was seriously engaged, the moment its cross-references with canonical scripture were mapped, and its astronomical content was examined against the known record, the implications became very difficult to manage within the framework of conventional scholarship. So the text was managed instead, kept at the margins of serious inquiry, assigned to specialists whose work was published in journals with limited circulation, framed consistently as a curiosity rather than a primary source, ensuring that the general educated public would encounter it if they encountered it at all, already wrapped in the language of irrelevance. What the science conceals and what the text itself read carefully in the original sequential logic of its chapters rather than in the fragmented excerpts that appear in mainstream discussions makes very clear is that the judgment described in Enoch's account is not primarily a theological judgment. It is a historical one. When the archangels look down from their position and see what has happened on earth, when they observe the blood being shed, the lawlessness spreading through human civilization like fire through dry grass, the lamentation of those who have been consumed by what the Watchers set in motion, their response is not the response of beings witnessing an unexpected theological crisis. It is the response of beings witnessing the predictable consequences of a known violation. They knew what would happen. The text implies that the premises of the transgression were understood before it occurred, which in turn implies that the prohibition existed because the outcome had been calculated, that the knowledge transmitted by the Watchers was not forbidden because it was dangerous in some abstract moral sense, but because its introduction at this particular stage of human development would produce precisely the catastrophic imbalance that the text goes on to describe in careful sequential detail. The souls of those who have died cry out to the gates of heaven. The earth itself makes its accusation against the lawless ones. And in the silence that follows, the silence before the divine response arrives, the silence in which the archangels must wait with the weight of what they have witnessed, pressing against them, there is a quality of recognition that is deeply familiar to anyone who has spent time in the late-night archives where inconvenient documents are held. It is the recognition of a system encountering the consequences of a decision that was made at some level by those who understood those consequences in advance and chose to proceed regardless. The Watchers chose. The text is very clear on this point. Samjaza himself articulates the possibility that the others will not follow through, and the oath they swear collectively is the oath of beings who understand that what they are doing is irreversible and choose to bind themselves to it anyway. The silence that follows that choice is the silence of a door closing. A door that once closed will require something of extraordinary force and patience to open again. That force and patience are precisely what the divine response applies. The commands given to each archangel are measured, specific, and long in their time frame. Bind them for 70 generations. Cast the knowledge into the darkness. Heal the earth slowly. Proclaim the healing so that the children of men may not all perish through the secrets the Watchers disclosed. The healing is not instantaneous because the damage was not instantaneous. It propagated through time, through culture, through the transmission of knowledge that had been introduced into a system not yet equipped to carry it without catastrophic distortion. And the silence that the institutional archives have maintained around this account for over 1,000 years is, in its own way, a continuation of that management, a slow, careful generational effort to ensure that the full account of what was introduced and what it cost remains outside the boundary of what the general human population is permitted to seriously consider. What they preserved within that silence and what the text reveals when the silence finally breaks is stranger and more consequential still. There are epochs that history has been trained to skip over, not because the evidence for them is absent, but because the evidence, when examined honestly and without the filtering lens of institutional consensus, leads to conclusions that the existing frameworks of scholarship are structurally unable to accommodate. These are the epochs that appear in the ground as anomalies in the textual record, as fragments in the oral traditions of cultures separated by oceans, as eerily convergent memories of a time before the time that the official narrative designates as the beginning. The Book of Enoch preserves the most detailed written account of one such epoch, a period so thoroughly buried beneath the sediment of deliberate suppression and institutional reclassification that most people who encounter references to it have already been conditioned to receive those references as mythology rather than memory. But memory is precisely what it is, and the epoch it remembers carries within it implications for the understanding of human history that no amount of archival silence has yet succeeded in fully extinguishing. The epoch Enoch describes is not a primitive one. This is the first and most important thing to understand when approaching the text without the preconceptions that centuries of managing interpretation have layered it. The civilization that existed before the Great Destruction the text describes was a civilization in possession of knowledge that the conventional timeline of human development insists should not have been available to it. Astronomical knowledge precise enough to track the courses of individual stars and record their deviations from appointed paths. Metallurgical knowledge sophisticated enough to produce weapons and ornaments of a quality that the archaeological record, when it surfaces evidence of sudden unexplained advancement, has never satisfactorily attributed to indigenous gradual development. Agricultural knowledge detailed enough to produce yields that the text describes in terms of extraordinary abundance. This was not a primitive world stumbling towards civilization. This was a world that had, through means the official record refuses to examine, directly arrived at a level of technical and cosmological sophistication that the destruction subsequently erased so thoroughly that what came after it had to begin in many respects again from the beginning. The mechanism of that erasure is described in the text with the same calm sequential precision that characterizes its account of the original transgression. The waters above and the waters beneath are opened simultaneously. The earth receives what the heavens release. The destruction is total in its reach and deliberate in its architecture. It is not the random violence of a natural catastrophe, but the measured response of a system correcting an imbalance, removing from the record not only the beings who introduced the transgression, but the entire civilizational structure that grew from it. What survives by specific designation. Noah selected not randomly, but through a process the text describes in terms that suggest a calculated preservation of particular genetic and cultural material. His 3 sons with him, the seed of a world that will have to rebuild from what remains after the flood, has done the work that the text frames not as punishment in the punitive sense, but as restoration. A return of the earth to a condition in which the next phase of human development can proceed without the distorting inheritance of knowledge introduced before its time. What the forgotten epoch leaves behind, preserved in forms that the subsequent civilizations could not fully interpret, because the context in which the knowledge was originally embedded had been removed along with the civilization that held it, is visible to the patient observer in the archaeological records, in ways that mainstream scholarship has spent considerable institutional energy explaining around rather than explaining. The monument alignments that encode astronomical knowledge requiring centuries of observation, the mythological traditions that carry beneath their surface symbolism, technical information about celestial mechanics that should not have been available to the cultures that transmitted them, the sudden appearances in the archaeological record of sophisticated systems, writing mathematics, irrigation, administrative organization that emerge without the developmental precursors that every theory of indigenous origin predicts must be present in the ground. These are not anomalies in the sense of errors in the record. They are the fingerprints of the forgotten epoch pressed into the foundation of every subsequent civilization by the simple fact that what the Watchers taught did not disappear when the flood came. It went underground, preserved in the memories of the survivors, transmitted in fragments through traditions that did not always understand what they were carrying, surfacing in pieces across the millennia, in forms that the institutions responsible for interpreting them have found consistently more comfortable to classify as mythology than to examine as historical residue. Enoch himself stands at the threshold of the forgotten epoch, a figure who existed. The text insists in a time before the destruction, who was hidden before it came, whose days were with the holy ones, and whose account of what he witnessed was preserved precisely because what he witnessed needed a witness. The words of the blessing of Enoch the text opens were for the elect and righteous who would be living in the days of tribulation, which is to say they were not written for the epoch in which they were first spoken, but for the one that came after the one, in which the memory of what had been lost would be most needed and most dangerous to possess. That epoch is this one. The forgotten past is not as distant as the silence around it has been designed to make it seem, and what the text reveals as it descends further into the account of what Enoch saw when he was taken beyond the boundaries of the world he knew reaches depths that the forgotten epoch's erasure was specifically intended to prevent anyone from finding again. There is a concept that the official histories of every major civilization have been designed at the deepest structural level to make unthinkable the concept that what we call the beginning was not a beginning at all but a reset, a deliberate architecturally precise erasure of what came before, followed by a carefully managed reconstruction of what would come after, built on foundations that were chosen not by the populations who would inhabit them, but by forces whose understanding of the long arc of human development operated on a timescale that no individual lifetime and no single institutional memory was equipped to fully comprehend. The Book of Enoch is one of the very few surviving documents that describes this reset from the inside, not as mythology, not as allegory, not as the symbolic language of a religious tradition, processing natural catastrophe through narrative, but as a sequential account of a decision made implemented and recorded by beings who understood exactly what they were doing and why. The decision, as the text renders it, was made in response to a specific calculation. The earth had been corrupted through the works that were taught not through human failing in isolation, but through the introduction of knowledge into a developmental stage that could not carry it without catastrophic distortion. The giants born of the Watchers had consumed the acquisitions of men. When men could no longer sustain them, the giants had turned against the men themselves. The earth had laid accusation against the lawless ones with the kind of systemic urgency that the text renders not as metaphor, but as a literal report reaching the archangels who carried it upward through whatever structural hierarchy the cosmos maintained for the processing of such complaints. The response was the reset total deliberate and calibrated to preserve only what the next phase of development would require, eliminating everything else, with the kind of thoroughness that leaves in the archaeological record exactly the kind of discontinuity that mainstream scholarship has spent considerable effort explaining as the result of gradual cultural drift rather than sudden catastrophic erasure. What is preserved in the reset is as instructive as what is destroyed. Noah is chosen, but the text is careful to specify the basis of that choice, not righteousness in the abstract moral sense that later theological interpretation layered onto the account, but purity in a more specific sense, a guiltlessness with respect to the particular transgression that necessitated the reset. He did not participate in the reception of forbidden knowledge. His seed carries forward the developmental potential of humanity without the distorting inheritance of premature transmission. His 3 sons represent the branching of that potential into the multiple streams that will become the post-Diluvian civilizations, the ones that the archaeology of the ancient Near East and the Mediterranean and beyond documents as emerging with that troubling suddenness that the mainstream timeline has never adequately explained, from a condition of relative simplicity into one of sophisticated organization, as if they were not inventing civilization from the beginning, but reconstructing it from a memory that had survived the water in fragments carried in the minds of those who came off the vessel and walked again onto an earth that was clean and empty and waiting to be rewritten. The reset is not presented in the text as a punishment in the sense that the later theological traditions which inherited the story and reshaped it to serve their own institutional requirements consistently rendered it. It is presented as a restoration, a return of the system to a condition of operational integrity after a violation that had propagated through it with sufficient force and duration to make partial correction impossible. The stores of blessing that the text describes as held in the chambers of heaven, ready to be sent down upon the earth after the restoration, are not the blessings of a deity rewarding obedience. They are the resources of a system resuming normal function after an emergency interruption, truth and peace. The text says associated together throughout all the days of the world and throughout all the generations of men, as if the natural state of the system absent the distortion introduced by the Watchers is one of alignment rather than conflict, abundance rather than scarcity, knowledge transmitted in its proper sequence, rather than injected at intervals that the receiving civilization was not yet equipped to metabolize. This is the image that the forgotten epoch leaves behind for those patient enough to sit with it in the long, quiet hours when the official narrative has receded far enough to allow something older and stranger to be heard. The image of a world not fallen in the theological sense but disrupted in the developmental one, reset with the careful precision of a system that understands its own parameters and is committed across timescales that dwarf the entirety of recorded history, to the eventual realization of something the text calls the plant of righteousness and truth. That plant was promised after the reset. Its roots were laid in the clean earth of the post-Diluvian world, and what the text describes as growing from those roots the long, slow generation by generation unfolding of a plan whose full scope Enoch was shown in the heavenly tablets, and which he recorded with the ink of a man who understood that what he was writing was not for his own epoch, but for one still distant from his own, is what the subsequent chapters of this reading will bring you toward as slowly in the dark as the reset world settles into its long and complicated future. What surfaces next in the echo of everything the flood carried away is stranger than the destruction itself. There is a phenomenon that archaeologists who work at the edges of the conventional timeline encounter with a regularity that the published literature carefully managed, as it rarely reflects with full honesty the phenomenon of the echo. It appears in the ground as a motif repeated across cultures that should have had no contact with one another, in the textual record as a story told in different languages, that nonetheless carries the same structural skeleton beneath its varying symbolic clothing, in the astronomical alignments of monuments separated by oceans, as the same celestial knowledge encoded in stone by hands that, according to the accepted chronology, could not possibly have shared a common source. The echo is the residue of the reset, the trace left in the collective memory of the post-diluvian world by everything that was lost when the waters came and took the forgotten epoch down with them into the deep. And the Book of Enoch is among all the surviving documents of the ancient world, the text that most clearly identifies what the echo is echoing. The Parables of Enoch, the second great section of the book, the section that the earliest Christian communities found so theologically charged that its influence on the New Testament is visible to any reader willing to examine the source material without the filters that institutional interpretation has placed over it, are the echo given its most precise literary form. They describe what Enoch saw when he was carried by the whirlwind to the end of the heavens, and shown the dwelling places of the holy and the resting places of the righteous, the elect one seated beneath the wings of the Lord of Spirits, the fountains of wisdom, inexhaustible and surrounded by those who drank from them and were filled. This is not poetry in the decorative sense. It is the preservation in the only language available to a human consciousness attempting to transmit an experience that exceeded the boundaries of human conceptual framework of something that was shown to Enoch precisely because it needed to be shown. Because the reset had removed the direct institutional memory of it from the world, and what remained needed to be encoded in a form that could survive the long journey through time to the epoch in which it would be most needed. The echo reaches the post-diluvian civilizations in fragments, and what is remarkable about those fragments is not their diversity, but their convergence. The Mesopotamian traditions carry within their cosmological accounts the memory of beings who descended and taught the Apkallu, the seven sages, who brought the arts of civilization to humanity before the flood, whose knowledge was preserved in the Apsu beneath the earth and retrieved after the waters receded. The Egyptian traditions embed in their earliest religious texts an astronomy so precise and a cosmological understanding so sophisticated that the scholars who have examined them most carefully have consistently found themselves unable to account for its origin within the conventional framework of Egyptian cultural development. The Hindu traditions preserve in their oldest layers accounts of beings of extraordinary knowledge and longevity who interacted with humanity in a period before the Great Destruction, whose teachings were carried forward by those who survived into the diminished world that came after. These are not coincidences. They are echoes. They are the same memory fragmented by the catastrophe and distributed across the surviving populations, each tradition preserving a different piece of a picture that only becomes visible when you step back far enough to see all the pieces simultaneously. What the Book of Enoch provides for the reader willing to approach it with the patience and the open attention that the late hours of the night are particularly suited to cultivating is the original source of the echo, the account from which all the fragmentary traditions are echoing, the document that was suppressed with such sustained institutional force precisely because it named the source clearly enough that anyone reading it alongside the comparative mythological record would immediately recognize the convergence. The elect ones seen in the parable, whose name was named before the sun, and the signs were created before the stars of the heaven were made, this figure echoes forward through the subsequent traditions with a persistence that no amount of institutional management has been able to fully silence, appearing in different languages, clothed in different symbolic frameworks, but carrying always the same essential character, the hidden one preserved before the creation of the world, revealed to the elects in the appointed time the staff of the righteous, the light of the Gentiles, the hope of those who are troubled of heart. The echo is not fading. This is what the comparative examination of the ancient record reveals to the scholar who has spent enough nights in the archives with the ink-stained manuscripts and the catalogues that do not appear in the public indices. The echo is, if anything, growing clearer, as the distance from the institutional management of the past increases and the capacity for open cross-referential inquiry expands beyond the boundaries that the controlling structures of previous centuries were able to maintain. The echo carries within it the full account of what was lost and what was promised in the aftermath of that loss. A promise encoded in the heavenly tablets that Enoch read and recorded, transmitted through the long chain of fragmentary traditions that preserved pieces of it across the millennia, and available now in the quiet dark of this particular hour to anyone patient enough to listen for it beneath the surface of the official silence. What the echo reveals as the night deepens and the body grows heavier, and the mind drifts closer to the threshold where the boundary between the waking record and something older becomes permeable, is only beginning to come clear. There is a discipline that exists at the intersection of archaeology, comparative mythology, and astronomical history that the institutional structures of mainstream academia have never been entirely comfortable acknowledging as a legitimate field of inquiry, the discipline of pattern recognition across deep time. It is the practice of examining the full sweep of the ancient record, textual and physical and astronomical simultaneously, and identifying within that record the recurring structures that suggest not the random accretion of independently developed cultural responses to a shared natural environment, but the deliberate transmission of a single body of knowledge through multiple channels over a time frame that dwarfs the entirety of what the conventional historical narrative designates as recorded history. The Book of Enoch is for those who practice this discipline with the patience and the methodological rigor it demands, one of the most important primary sources in the ancient record. Not because it tells a story, but because it names a pattern and describes with the precision of a document composed by someone who had seen the pattern from outside its own temporal boundaries exactly what that pattern was designed to produce. The pattern begins with the astronomical sections of the text, which have been among the most consistently under-examined portions of the Enochist account, precisely because their implications, when taken seriously, are among the most structurally disruptive to the conventional timeline. The Book of the Luminaries, the section in which Uriel shows Enoch the laws governing the movements of the sun and moon and stars, the portals through which they rise and set, the precise calculations of their courses across a calendar of 364 days, is not a primitive attempt to make sense of celestial observation. It is a sophisticated astronomical system internally consistent and calibrated with a precision that the ancient world was not supposed to possess, encoding within its mathematical relationships a model of cosmic order whose implications the earliest readers of the text understood very well. The sun and moon complete their course and deviate not from their ordinance from eternity to eternity. The stars complete their course, and he calls them by their names, and they answer him from eternity to eternity. This is not poetry. This is a description of a lawful system, a cosmos operating according to principles that were known before the system was created, and that will remain in operation after every human civilization built within it has run its course. The pattern that this astronomical knowledge encodes is the pattern of cycles, as great cycles of time in which civilizations rise, reach a particular threshold of development, encounter a crisis whose nature is consistently described across traditions in terms that correspond with striking precision to the Enochist account of the Watcher's transgression and are reset. The Hindu tradition preserves this pattern in the doctrine of the Yuga's vast epochs of time through which consciousness descends from its highest expression into its most degraded. And then after the reset begins the long ascent again. The Mesopotamian tradition preserves it in the account of the antediluvian kings, 10 generations of beings of extraordinary longevity who ruled before the flood, each one carrying a piece of the knowledge transmitted before the catastrophe. Their reigns are measured in units of time, so vast that the conventional historiography has classified them as mythological rather than engaging with the question of what tradition of actual chronological memory they might be preserving. The Egyptian tradition preserves it in the Zep-Tepi, the first time, the epoch before the epoch when the gods walked on earth, and the knowledge that would define Egyptian civilization for 3,000 years was transmitted in its complete form before the gradual degradation that the historical record documents as the long arc of Egyptian cultural decline across the millennia. What the Book of Enoch adds to this comparative picture, what makes it the most precise and most institutionally threatening of all the sources that encode the pattern, is that it provides not only the description of the cycle, but the account of the mechanism by which the cycle is managed. The 70 generations for which the Watchers are bound in the valleys of the earth before their final judgment, the heavenly tablets on which the deeds of every generation are recorded, the books of the living opened before the head of days at the moment of reckoning. These are not mythological images in the sense of decorative narrative elements. They are descriptions of a system of observation, recording, and periodic adjustment operating across timescales that no individual human consciousness can hold, entire, managed by beings whose relationship to time is sufficiently different from humanity's own that the cycles which constitute the full arc of human development appear to them as observable and navigable, rather than overwhelming and incomprehensible. Enoch was shown this system. He was shown it precisely because someone needed to have seen it and recorded the seeing, because the pattern needed a witness in the human record, someone whose account, however, buried and suppressed by the institutions that found it inconvenient, would survive long enough to reach the epoch in which its recognition was most needed. That witness recorded what he saw with the careful hand of a man who understood that the ink he was setting to parchment would outlast every institution that would subsequently attempt to ensure it did not survive. The pattern he preserved in those pages is older than any archive, deeper than any silence, and what it reveals next descends into territory that the official record was specifically designed to prevent anyone from reaching. There is a category of ancient document that the institutions responsible for managing the historical record have found consistently more dangerous than outright forgery or obvious myth, the category of the warning. Not the warning encoded in symbolic language sufficiently obscure to be diffused through allegorical interpretation. Not the warning wrapped in theological frameworks sufficiently familiar to be absorbed into existing institutional structures without disturbing their foundations, but the warning given in plain sequential language by a source that demonstrates through the precision and internal consistency of its other claims that it understood what it was describing with a clarity that places it outside the comfortable boundaries of what the conventional narrative classifies as ancient religious imagination. The Book of Enoch is in its deepest structure precisely this kind of document, and the warnings it contains embedded within the astronomical and cosmological material that the institutional record has most consistently worked to keep outside the boundaries of serious scholarly engagement, are warnings addressed not to the epoch in which they were first spoken, but to the one in which the pattern they describe reaches its most critical phase. The warning encoded in the heavenly tablets section of the text is specific in a way that demands the careful reader's full attention. In the days of the sinners, Uriel tells Enoch the years shall be shortened, and their seed shall be tardy on their lands and fields. All things on the earth shall alter and shall not appear in their time. The rain shall be kept back, and the heaven shall withhold it. The fruits of the earth shall be backward and shall not grow in their time, and the fruits of the trees shall be withheld in their time. The moon shall alter her order and not appear at her time. The sun shall journey in the evening on the extremity of the great chariot in the west, and shall shine more brightly than accords with the order of light. These are not vague prophetic gestures towards some unspecified future catastrophe. These are precise descriptions of systemic disruption, agricultural failure, climatic irregularity, celestial anomaly that the text explicitly connects to a specific moral and behavioral condition of the civilization experiencing them, as if the disruption of the natural order and the disruption of the ethical order are not parallel phenomena, but aspects of a single integrated system whose coherence, when violated at the level of human behavior, propagates its disorder outward into the physical and astronomical environment. The scholars who have examined this section of the text most carefully, working in the late-night corridors of the kind of archives that do not appear in public catalogues, cross-referencing the Enochic material against the astronomical and climatic records preserved in cuneiform tablets and Egyptian administrative documents, and the dendrochronological data embedded in ancient timber, have found in the warning a precision that is deeply uncomfortable for anyone committed to the conventional narrative of ancient religious imagination as a phenomenon fundamentally disconnected from empirical observation. The celestial anomalies described in the text correspond with sufficient specificity to actual documented astronomical events in the ancient record that the correspondence cannot be dismissed as coincidence, without the kind of motivated reasoning that the institutional framework of mainstream scholarship is specifically designed to make invisible to those operating within it. The warning was not constructed from an imagination, it was constructed from observation, the observation of a being who had been shown in the heavenly tablets the full arc of what the pattern produces at each stage of its cycling, and who understood with sufficient clarity what the signs of an approaching critical threshold looked like to describe them, in terms that a careful reader encountering them in the appropriate epoch would immediately recognize. What makes the warning most structurally threatening to the institutions that have worked to keep this text at the margins of serious inquiry is not its content in isolation, but its context. The fact that it appears within a document that is already demonstrated through its astronomical sections and its precise account of the Watcher's transgression, and its detailed description of the mechanism of the cosmic reset, a level of systemic understanding that places it categorically outside the conventional definition of ancient mythology. A warning issued by a source that demonstrably understood the astronomical system in which the warned against events are embedded is a warning that demands a fundamentally different quality of attention than a warning issued by a source whose cosmological framework is internally inconsistent or externally unverifiable. The Book of Enoch has passed every test of internal consistency that the comparative scholarly examination of its astronomical content has applied to it, which means that the warning it contains has also passed those tests, and that the institutions responsible for managing the public understanding of the ancient record have had very specific reasons across the millennium, and more of the text's suppression for ensuring that the warning remained outside the boundaries of what the general educated population was permitted to encounter as a serious historical document rather than a curiosity of marginal religious interest. The warning reaches you now, traveller, in the long quiet of this particular night through the same channel that preserved everything else. The text contains the channel of patient transmission across the generations, the slow movement of truth through the gaps in the institutional silence, the survival of words that were carved deeply enough into the foundation of the human record that no amount of archival management has succeeded in removing them entirely. What the warning points toward and what the subsequent sections of the text make progressively clearer as the account descends into the full account of what Enoch saw when he was shown the secrets of the heaven and the earth simultaneously carries a gravity that the official silence was specifically constructed to prevent anyone from feeling. Yet the record does not end there. There is a knowledge of the sky that predates every civilization. The conventional timeline acknowledges as the origin point of systematic astronomical observation, a knowledge so precise in its encoding, so consistent in its cross-cultural transmission, and so structurally incompatible with the developmental trajectory that mainstream archaeology assigns to the ancient world that the scholars who have examined it most carefully have spent the better part of their careers navigating the institutional pressure to classify their findings as speculative rather than engage with what the evidence examined, without the filters of consensus archaeology actually suggests. The Book of Enoch preserves the most detailed textual account of where that knowledge came from, who transmitted it, and why the institutions that inherited it subsequently worked with such sustained and coordinated energy to ensure that the account of its origin remained outside the boundaries of what the general educated population was permitted to consider as a legitimate historical question, rather than a matter of religious mythology, safely diffused through allegorical interpretation. The astronomical content of the Enochic text is not incidental to its larger argument. It is structural. The book of the courses of the luminaries of the heaven. The section in which Uriel guides Enoch through the precise mechanics of solar and lunar movement, the portals through which the great luminaries rise and set across the cycle of the year, the calculations of days and their divisions across a calendar, whose mathematical relationships encode a model of cosmic order that the conventional history of astronomy insists should not have been available to the ancient world in this form, is positioned within the text, not as a digression from the central narrative of the Watchers and their transgression, but as its necessary context. The sky in the Enochic framework is not a backdrop against which human events unfold. It's a system lawful, observable, calibrated across timescales that exceed the entirety of recorded history, within which human development is embedded, as a dependent variable subject to the same principles of order and consequence that govern the movements of the sun and moon and stars in their appointed courses. The 6 portals through which the sun rises across the cycle of the year, the corresponding portals of its setting, the precise accounting of the lengthening and shortening of days across the 12 months, the relationship between the solar year of 364 days and the lunar cycle with its systematic falling behind. This is not the astronomical knowledge of a civilization in the early stages of celestial observation. This is the astronomical knowledge of a civilization that has been observing the sky with systematic precision for a very long time, encoding its observations in a calendar system whose mathematical relationships are internally consistent and externally verifiable against the actual mechanics of the solar system. The question that the conventional timeline cannot answer without abandoning its most fundamental assumptions is the question of where this knowledge came from, who observed, who calculated, who encoded, and through what institutional structure the knowledge was preserved across the generations that must have been required to accumulate it. The text answers this question with the same directness it applies to every other element of the account. Uriel, the holy angel, who is the leader of them all, showed Enoch the laws of the luminaries exactly as they are and how it is with regard to all the years of the world and unto eternity till the new creation is accomplished. The angel who guides the astronomical revelation is the same angel who oversees the world and Tartarus, who operates, in other words, across the full vertical extent of the Enochic cosmos from the highest celestial registers to the deepest places of confinement. The knowledge he transmits to Enoch is not knowledge that Enoch has derived through independent observation. It is knowledge that exists in a form already complete, already systematized, already calibrated against the full arc of cosmic time knowledge that predates the human civilization into which Enoch was born, and that will remain operative long after the civilizations that suppress the account of its transmission have run their full course and receded into the ground. What the sky encodes for those who approach it with the attention and the patience that the Enochic text models in its careful sequential movement through the astronomical material is a message that the reciter was specifically designed to preserve across the discontinuity of the catastrophe. The stars that complete their course and answer when called by name, the sun that traverses its path without deviation, that adds nothing to its orbit and takes nothing from it. These are not decorative images of divine reliability. They are the persistent signal of a system whose lawfulness operates independently of the civilizational structures that have been built within it, and whose message legible to anyone who develops the astronomical literacy to read it is that the pattern continues, regardless of what any particular epoch does, to obscure or manage or suppress the account of its own operation. The sky watched every institution that worked to bury the Book of Enoch. The sky watched every archive where its copies were sealed, and every council where its exclusion was debated, and the sky in the long quiet of this particular night, as the body grows heavier and the mind drifts closer to the threshold of sleep, continues to transmit the same lawful signal that Enoch recorded in the language available to him, a signal older than any silence, more patient than any suppression, and carrying within it the full weight of everything that the forgotten epoch left behind when the waters came and the world was made clean again. What the earth preserved beneath that cleansing, and the ground and the stone and the deep memory of the survivors, is what the next chapter brings you toward. There is a knowledge of the earth that runs deeper than any archive, older than any institutional memory, more persistent than any program of suppression that the structures of organized power have applied to its concealment across the millennia of recorded history. A knowledge preserved not in manuscripts that can be seized, or catalogues that can be edited, but in the ground itself, in the stone alignments and buried foundations and deep stratigraphic layers that carry within them the physical residue of everything the official narrative has classified as either mythological or insufficiently documented to warrant serious scholarly engagement. The Book of Enoch is one of the very few surviving textual sources that provides a coherent account of what that physical residue represents, what civilization left it behind, through what catastrophic mechanism it was buried, and why the knowledge of its existence has been maintained by the institutions responsible for managing the public understanding of the ancient record at a level of systematic obscurity that can only be understood as deliberate once you have spent enough time examining the pattern of its management across the centuries. The earth that Enoch is shown in the visions of the astronomical and cosmological sections of the text is not the earth of naive ancient cosmology, flat-bounded, resting on pillars, a simple stage for human events. It is an earth embedded within a cosmos of extraordinary structural complexity, its foundations laid through the same oath that governs the movements of the sun and moon and stars, its cornerstone observed by Enoch in the course of a journey that takes him through the treasuries of the winds, the mouths of the rivers, the places where the waters of the deep originate, the mountains of the darkness of winter, and the ends of the earth where the firmament of heaven rests upon the ground, and the portals through which the stars proceed stand open to the observer patient enough to reach them. This is not a primitive picture of the physical world. It is a sophisticated one, a picture of an earth understood as a system, governed by the same lawful principles that govern the celestial mechanics Uriel reveals in the astronomical sections, subject to the same cycles of order and disruption that the pattern of the Watcher's transgression and its aftermath has already established as the dominant structural principle of the Enoch cosmos, What the earth preserves for those who approach it with the methodological patience that the evidence demands is the physical confirmation of the textual account, not in the form that the institutional archaeology of the mainstream would recognize as acceptable evidence, which is to say, not in the form of labeled artifacts recovered from documented excavation sites and interpreted within the consensus framework, but in the form of the anomalies that accumulate at the edges of the acceptable record like sediment building against a barrier, each one individually explainable within the conventional framework through the application of sufficient institutional ingenuity, but collectively pointing in a direction that the consensus framework was specifically designed to prevent anyone from following to its logical conclusion. The structures built to alignments that the civilizations credited with their construction should not have possessed the astronomical knowledge to calculate. The evidence of sophisticated hydraulic engineering in layers that predate the conventional origin points of hydraulic civilization by margins too large to be dismissed as a measurement error. The distribution of mythological motifs across archaeological sites separated by distances and chronological gaps that the conventional models of cultural diffusion cannot bridge without abandoning their most fundamental assumptions about the pace and mechanism of ancient cultural contact. The valley that Uriel shows Enoch, the cursed valley where those who uttered unseemly words against the glory of the Lord shall be gathered for judgment in the last days, is positioned within the text between two descriptions of blessed places, as if the geography of the afterlife mirrors the geography of the living earth, in its alternation of abundance and desolation, its placement of judgment within the landscape of beauty, its insistence that the reckoning is not separate from the world, but embedded within it, written into the physical structure of the ground beneath every civilization that has ever been built upon the surface of the post-Diluvian Earth. The Earth remembers what the archives were designed to forget. It holds in its layers the compressed record of everything the reset removed from the surface, the civilizational material of the forgotten epoch pressed down by the weight of the flood sediment and the subsequent millennia of human construction above it, waiting with the patience of geological time for the moment when the instruments of investigation become sufficiently rotated and the institutional pressure to look away becomes sufficiently weakened that the full picture can finally begin to emerge. What the Earth is carrying in the deep places where the conventional archaeology has not yet looked, or has looked, and found it more institutionally convenient not to report with full transparency, is the confirmation of everything. The Book of Enoch describes the evidence of a civilization that possessed knowledge it should not have possessed, that reached a threshold whose crossing triggered a response calibrated at a level of cosmic precision that the surviving record has preserved in fragments across every ancient tradition, that maintained sufficient institutional independence to carry the memory forward without fully suppressing it. The ground is speaking traveller in the language of the anomaly, and the buried foundation and the misaligned chronology, to anyone patient enough to listen in the long quiet hours when the official narrative has grown still enough that something older can be heard beneath it. What returns from beneath that ground in the chapter that follows carries with it the full weight of everything the earth was given to hold. There is a moment in the study of the deep historical record when the cumulative weight of everything that has been suppressed, buried, reclassified, and managed into institutional invisibility begins to exert a pressure in the opposite direction. When the fragments preserved across the surviving traditions reach a critical density of convergence and the pattern they collectively encode becomes sufficiently clear that the question is no longer whether the account is accurate, but what the implications of its accuracy mean for every structure of knowledge and power that has been built across the millennia of the suppression's duration, on the assumption that the account would never surface in a form sufficiently complete to demand that reckoning. The Book of Enoch describes this moment with the particular precision of a document that was composed specifically for it, a text that its author understood would travel through time to reach an epoch whose relationship to the warnings and the promises and the pattern it contained would be one not of historical distance but of immediate and pressing relevance. The return it describes is not the return of a deity in the theological sense, that the later traditions, which inherited fragments of the account and reshaped them to serve their own institutional requirements, consistently rendered it. It is the return of a reckoning, the reassertion of the lawful order whose disruption by the Watchers and subsequent management by the institutions that followed has been across the full arc of the pattern the central narrative of human civilizational history. The imagery in which the text encodes this return is among the most cinematically powerful in the entirety of the ancient record, the elect one seated upon the throne of glory. The books of the living opened before the head of days, the mountains leaping like rams and the hills skipping like lambs, satisfied with milk, the faces of the angels in heaven lighted up with joy, and the earth rejoicing with its righteous inhabitants walking upon it in the light that no institution has been able to permanently extinguish, because it does not originate within any institution, but within the lawful structure of the cosmos itself. These images have been absorbed into the theological traditions that inherited them, and rendered in terms sufficiently familiar and domesticated that the structural challenge they represent to the conventional narrative has been effectively neutralized for most of the populations that encountered them. But the original text read in its sequential logic without the interpretive filters of the traditions that domesticated it. It is not a theological document in the sense of a text whose primary function is the management of individual spiritual practice. It is a historical document in the sense of a text whose primary function is the recording of a pattern whose culminating phase the author understood he was describing for the benefit of those who would be living through it. The kings and the mighty who possess the earth, the text's consistent designation for the institutional structures of organized power across the full arc of the pattern, are shown in the return sequence in a condition of recognition that the earlier phases of their dominance specifically work to prevent. They see and recognize how the elect one sits on the throne of his glory. They bless and glorify and extol him who rules over all, who is hidden, with the particular quality of acknowledgement that comes too late to alter the outcome. It is acknowledging the recognition of those who built their authority on the suppression of a truth that has finally surfaced beyond the reach of their capacity to manage it. The darkness grows deeper on their faces. Their hope was in the sceptre of their kingdom and in their own glory. And now, at the moment when the full account becomes visible and the pattern reaches its culminating phase, that hope is revealed to have been built on a foundation that was never as solid as the institutions maintaining it required it to appear. What the return makes visible for the traveller who has followed this account through the long descent from the initial suppression through the evidence and the anomaly and the silence and the forgotten epoch and the reset and the echo and the pattern and the warning and the sky and the earth to this particular threshold is not a new revelation, but the full form of a revelation that has been present in the record all along, preserved in the fragments of every tradition that maintained sufficient independence to carry pieces of it forward, encoded in the astronomical alignments and the buried foundations and the ink-stained manuscripts of the scholars who got close enough to the full picture to understand what they were looking at before the institutional pressure redirected their attention. The elect one was hidden before the creation of the world, the text says, and the wisdom of the Lord of Spirits revealed him to the holy and righteous at the appointed time. The appointed time is not a theological abstraction. It is a specific phase in the pattern, the phase in which the accumulated weight of the suppression reaches a critical threshold of unsustainability, and the truth that was hidden becomes, through the patient operation of the same lawful principles that govern the movements of the sun and moon and stars, impossible to keep from surfacing. That surface is here. That threshold is now, and what waits on the other side of it in the reflection of the full account it produces in the mind of the listener who has followed it to this point, carries the particular gravity of something that was always going to return, regardless of what any institution in any epoch did to prevent it. There is a particular quality of understanding that arrives not in the moment of discovery, but in the moment of reflection. The moment when the full weight of what has been witnessed settles into the consciousness of the observer with a completeness that the initial encounter, however powerful, was not yet equipped to produce. Enoch experiences this moment repeatedly throughout the account, and the text renders it with the kind of psychological precision that suggests its author understood something important about the relationship between revelation and integration, between the experience of being shown something that exceeds the boundaries of the existing conceptual framework and the slower, quieter process of allowing that experience to reorganize the framework itself from the inside. The tears that flow when Enoch awakes from the dream, visions the prostration before the throne, the trembling that seizes him when the heaven of heavens quakes and the host of the Most High is disturbed. These are not the responses of a man overwhelmed by supernatural spectacle. They are the responses of a man in the process of integrating a knowledge that has permanently altered his relationship to everything he understood before he received it. The reflection that the full Enochic account produces in the listener who has followed it through its complete sequential logic from the descent of the Watchers through the transgression, and the transgression's consequences through the reset and the echo and the pattern and the warning to the return of the reckoning, is a reflection of precisely this quality. It is not the reflection of someone who has encountered a new piece of information to be filed alongside existing information, without disturbing the architecture of the system in which that information is held, is the reflection of someone who has encountered an account that, if taken seriously as what its internal evidence suggests, it is a precise historical record of events whose implications for the understanding of human civilization have been suppressed with sustained institutional force for more than a millennium, requires a fundamental reorganization of the framework through which the entirety of the historical record has been approached. This is why the suppression was so sustained, so coordinated, so carefully maintained across so many centuries and through so many different institutional forms. It was not the content of the text that threatened the structures that worked to bury it. It was the reflection the content produced, the particular quality of understanding that arrives when a listener follows the account to its conclusion and realizes in the quiet aftermath of that arrival that what they have been told about the past is not wrong in its details, so much as wrong in its fundamental orientation, turned away from the actual centre of the record by precisely the degree necessary to make the full picture invisible to anyone who did not know to look for it. The reflection is visible in the text itself, in the way Enoch processes what he has witnessed. When he has seen the celestial throne and been addressed by the Lord of Spirits, when he has been lifted by Michael through the secrets of righteousness, and shown the chambers of the stars and the luminaries and the full architecture of the cosmic system within which human development is embedded as a dependent variable, when he has read the heavenly tablets and understood the full arc of what generation upon generation shall transgress till a generation of righteousness arises. The response is not theological in the institutional sense. It is historical. He blesses the great Lord the King of Glory forever, not with the language of devotional practice, but with the language of a witness acknowledging the authority of the system whose operation he has been shown. He extols the Lord because of his patience, and the patience referenced is specifically the patience of a system that has been watching the full arc of the pattern unfold across timescales that dwarf every human institutional memory, absorbing the distortions introduced by the Watcher's transgression and the subsequent millennia of managed suppression, maintaining in the lawful operation of its astronomical and moral order the persistent signal that no archive closure and no manuscript confiscation and no council ruling has been able to interrupt. What the reflection reveals for the traveller who has arrived at this point in the long quiet descent through the Enochic account is that the text was always speaking to this moment, that the words of the blessing of Enoch, composed for the elect and righteous who would be living in the days of tribulation, were composed with the understanding that the days of their reception would be days in which the full weight of what had been suppressed was finally available to be felt, in the way that truth can only be felt when it arrives in the context of a reflection deep enough to hold it without distortion. The reflection is not comfortable. The understanding that arrives through it does not leave the framework of the past intact, but it arrives as the night deepens and the body grows heavier, and the mind approaches the threshold where the boundary between waking awareness and the deeper knowledge of sleep becomes permeable with the particular quality of something that has been travelling toward this moment for a very long time and has finally in the quiet of this particular hour reached its destination. What waits in the descent that follows the full account of what Enoch saw when he was taken below the surface of the visible world and shown what the earth holds in its deepest places carries the gravity of everything the reflection has prepared the listener to receive. There is a movement in the Enochic account that mirrors with the precision of a text that understood its own structural architecture, the movement of the consciousness that receives it, a progressive deepening, a descent through successive layers of revelation, each one carrying the listener further from the surface of the familiar and closer to the foundation of something that the surface world was specifically designed to obscure. The descent begins with the Watchers and the transgression, and moves through the cosmological and astronomical revelations and the parables of the elect one and deux, and the account of the reset and the long arc of the patterns unfolding. And it arrives in the later books of the Enochic corpus, at a place whose character is not darkness in the sense of absence, but darkness in the sense of depth, the particular quality of deep places that hold in their compressed and undisturbed stillness everything that the surface world has been unable to accommodate without distortion. The hollow places carved in the mountain of hard rock, the abyss full of fire and flaming pillars, the prison of the angels where the stars that transgress their appointed times are bound until the consummation of their guilt. These are not the landscapes of mythology in the decorative sense. They are the landscapes of a cosmos that takes its own accounting seriously, that maintains in its deep structure the record of every transgression and every consequence with the same lawful precision that it maintains in its astronomical structure the record of every stellar course and every deviation from a pointed order. What Enoch finds in the descent guided by Raphael through the hollow places where the spirits of the dead are assembled by Raguel, past the fire that persecutes the luminaries by Michael, through the 7 magnificent mountains to the fragrant tree that no mortal is permitted to touch, until the great judgment is not a simple geography of reward and punishment in the institutional theological sense. It is a systematic account of how the cosmos manages the full consequence of the Watcher's transgression across the timescale required for that management to reach its completion. The spirits of the dead are separated according to the specific character of their relationship to the transgression of the righteous in a place with a bright spring of water, the sinners in a place of great pain until the great day of judgment, those who were slain in the days of the sinners in a separate division, the complete transgressors in yet another. This is not the binary of paradise and damnation that the later theological traditions constructed from fragments of the Enochic material. It is a nuanced, carefully differentiated accounting system, a record of consequence as precise in its calibration as the astronomical record of the sun's daily movement through its portals across the cycle of the year. The descent into this deep accounting produces in the listener who follows it with the attention it demands a recognition that is both intellectually and physically felt, a settling of something that has been held in suspension since the beginning of the account into a clarity whose weight is not oppressive but grounding, not frightening but strangely restful, as if the knowledge of how deeply the cosmos takes its own reckoning seriously is paradoxically a source of the kind of peace that the surface world with its managed narratives and its institutional silences and its carefully maintained boundaries between what is permitted to be known and what is designated as mythology has never been able to provide. The fragrant tree that Michael shows Enoch on the 7th mountain, whose fragrance penetrates beyond any other fragrance and whose leaves and blooms and wood wither not forever, is the image of something preserved through the full duration of the descent intact, something that no catastrophe and no institutional suppression and no millennia of managed obscurity has been able to diminish. Waiting in the deep place of the cosmos for the appointed time when it shall be given to the righteous and holy transplanted to the holy place its fragrance in their bones, their lives increased in peace as the pattern reaches its culminating resolution. The descent in the Enochic framework is not a fall. It is a necessary movement through the full depth of what the cosmos contains, a journey that the listener is now completing in the long quiet of this particular night as the body grows heavier and the mind drifts closer to the threshold, where the boundary between waking reflection and something deeper, older, becomes in the way that the deepest hours of the night always make possible permeable. The deep places of the text have been holding this moment in readiness for a very long time. The fragrant tree waits with the patience of something that was placed there before the world as we know it began. And what the threshold reveals when the descent finally reaches it is what the entire account has been preparing the listener to receive. There is a place in every deep account where the narrative stops moving forward and begins instead to resonate where the accumulation of everything that has come before reaches a critical density, and the listener finds themselves standing not at the next stage of a journey that continues outward, but at a threshold whose character is defined not by what lies beyond it, but by the quality of attention required to cross it. The Book of Enoch places its reader at this threshold in the closing movements of its account, the epistolary sections in which Enoch speaks directly to his descendants, gathering them around him in the final year before his translation, transmitting in the concentrated form of a man who knows he's running out of time everything that the visions and the journeys and the heavenly tablets have shown him about the full arc of what is coming, and what it will require of those who receive the transmission faithfully enough to carry it forward through the long darkness of the suppression that will follow. The threshold is not a dramatic one in the conventional narrative sense. It does not announce itself with the kind of spectacular imagery that the earlier sections of the text deploy with such deliberate and sustained power. It arrives quietly in the register of a man speaking to his children, in the knowledge that the words he is choosing will have to travel farther than any human voice can carry them, and remain legible at a distance from their origin that would render most transmissions unrecognizable. The words of the Epistle of Enoch carry a different quality from the earlier sections of the account, and that difference is itself a form of information. Where the cosmological and astronomical sections move with the measured precision of a document recording the operation of a system whose principles are lawful and impersonal, the epistle moves with the gravity of a document recording the personal stakes of living within that system at a particular phase of its cycling, a phase in which violence increases and unrighteousness is consummated in a twofold degree, and the institutional structures that should be transmitting wisdom are instead transmitting the particular darkness of power that has forgotten its own derivation. Love, uprightness, and walk therein. Enoch tells the sons of righteousness, and draw not nigh to uprightness with a double heart, and associate not with those of a double heart. This is not theological instruction in the institutional sense. It is practical guidance for navigation advice, from someone who has seen the full picture of where the pattern leads and understands with sufficient clarity what the behavioural correlates of the alignment with the lawful order look like at the individual level. In contrast to the behavioural correlates of alignment with the institutional structures that have systematically mistaken their own authority for the authority of the system they were meant to serve. The woes that structure the epistle's central movement are not the woes of a moralist cataloguing sins against for the purpose of institutional enforcement. They are the woes of a witness identifying with the precision of someone who has read the heavenly tablets and seen the full consequence of every deviation from the lawful order, the specific categories of behaviour that the pattern's critical phase will render most visibly and catastrophically self-defeating. Woe to those who build unrighteousness and oppression and lay deceit as a foundation. Woe to those who acquire gold and silver in judgment. Woe to those who write down lying and godless words that men may hear them, and act godlessly toward their neighbours. These woes are not predictions in the sense of information about the future that the listener could not otherwise access. They are the structural analysis of a system by someone who understands its operating principles well enough to identify, without any special prophetic gift beyond the gnat, understanding the points at which the system's self-correcting mechanisms will assert themselves with the kind of force that the institutions inhabiting the distorted phase of the cycle consistently mistake for external judgment rather than internal consequence. The threshold at which the epistle places the listener is the threshold between the knowledge that has been transmitted and the response that the transmission demands, the point at which the account stops being something that is received and becomes something that is carried. Enoch preserves the books from thy father's hand, he tells Methuselah, and see that thou deliver them to the generations of the world. This is the transmission instruction that the entire account has been building toward, the recognition that the knowledge preserved in the text is not knowledge for contemplation alone, but knowledge for transmission, knowledge whose value is actualized not in the moment of its reception, but in the moment of its faithful carrying forward through whatever institutional darkness interposes itself between the moment of reception and the moment of the appointed arrival. The traveller who has followed this account through its full descent through the anomaly and the silence and the forgotten epoch and the reset and the echo and the pattern and the warning and the sky and the earth and the return and the reflection and the descent to this threshold is standing now at the place where the transmission becomes personal, where the knowledge that was carved deeply enough into the foundation of the human record to survive a millennium of suppression becomes, in the quiet of this particular night, something carried in the body and the breath of someone who has listened with sufficient patience and sufficient openness to receive it fully. What waits on the other side of this threshold in the deep descent into sleep that the final chapters of this night bring is the oldest kind of rest. The rest of someone who has carried something heavy a very long way and finally in the dark and the quiet been permitted to set it down. There is a quality of darkness that arrives only at a particular depth of the night, not the darkness of early evening, which still carries the residue of the day's noise and the institutional world's insistent demand for wakefulness and productivity and the maintenance of the surface attention that the conventional narrative requires in order to remain operative, but the darkness of the deep hours. The darkness that arrives when all of that has finally receded far enough that the body begins to remember something older than the day's requirements, something that predates every institutional structure and every managed narrative and every archive whose contents have been curated to prevent the listener from reaching precisely the threshold the long descent of this account has brought you to. This is the darkness in which the Book of Enoch was first heard by those who needed it most, the darkness of communities gathered in the late hours of the ancient world, listening to the transmission of a text that their institutional environment had already begun the process of suppressing, receiving in the quiet of that darkness a knowledge that the daylight world of official religious and political authority was increasingly unwilling to permit them to encounter in any form that retained its full structural challenge to the systems that managed their understanding of the past. The descent into sleep that the Enochic text models in its closing movements is not the descent of unconsciousness in the sense of the simple cessation of waking awareness. It is the descent of the consciousness that has been filled through the long, patient reception of the full account with something that will continue its work in the deeper registers of the mind long after the surface attention has released its grip on the sequential logic of the narrative and allowed the body to enter the restorative darkness that the deepest hours provide. Enoch himself falls asleep at the waters of Dan in the land of Dan, and what comes to him in that sleep, the visions of chastisement, the voice bidding him to reprimand the sons of heaven, the full revelation that the waking journey through the celestial and terrestrial landscapes has prepared him to receive in concentrated form, is not an interruption of the journey, but its continuation in a register where the boundary between what is known and what is transmitted becomes permeable in a way that the waking state, with its insistence on the sequential logic of cause and effect and the institutional boundaries of what constitutes acceptable knowledge, consistently prevents. The body that receives this account in the deep hours of the night is a body that has been brought through the progressive deepening of the account's descent from the surface narrative of suppression and transgression through the cosmological and astronomical revelations and the parables of the elect one and the warnings of the heavenly tablets to the personal transmission of the epistle to a condition of readiness that the institutional world of the waking day specifically works to prevent a condition in which the defences that the managed narrative has installed against the reception of a knowledge that challenges its own foundations have been through the patient operation of the account's deepening sufficiently lowered that something older and stranger and more structurally honest can enter and begin to do its work. The wisdom that passeth their thought, Enoch tells Methuselah, and those who understand it shall not sleep but shall listen with the ear, that they may learn this wisdom, and it shall please those that eat thereof better than good food. This is not a metaphor for intellectual engagement. It is a precise description of the particular wakefulness that the deepest knowledge produces, not the wakefulness of the surface attention maintained by the institutional demand for productive consciousness, but the wakefulness of something deeper that remains alert and receptive even as the body descends into rest. What descends with the listener into the darkness of sleep after the full account has been received with the patience and the open attention that the long hours of the night are uniquely suited to cultivating is not a collection of information to be stored in the categorized archives of the waking memory. It is something that functions more like a reorientation, a subtle but permanent shift in the relationship between the listener's understanding of the past and the listener's relationship to the present, produced by the simple act of having followed an account that was composed specifically for this epoch, by someone who understood that the epoch in which it would be most needed would also be the epoch in which the suppression of the knowledge it contained would have reached its maximum extension to the point where the truth it carries would arrive in the consciousness of its receivers with the particular force of something that has been travelling toward them for a very long time and has finally in the quiet of the deep hours found its destination. The names are written before the glory of the Great One. The portals of heaven shall be opened to you, and the voice of rest that the text promises to those who have suffered through the long darkness of the suppression, the voice that shall be heard from heaven is audible. Now, traveller, in the particular quality of this silence, in the weight of this darkness, in the slow deepening of the breath that marks the threshold between the world of managed narratives and the older, quieter, more truthful world that waits in the dark beneath it. There is a moment at the very end of every deep account when the narrative releases its listener not abruptly, not with the kind of conclusive finality that the institutional structures of the waking world prefer, but with the slow, gradual quality of something that has been held carefully in suspension across a very long journey and is now at the appointed completion of that journey, gently set down in a place of sufficient stillness and depth to receive it without distortion. The Book of Enoch arrives at this moment in the final words of the revelation of Enoch, the closing section of the epistle, in which the account that began with the descent of the Watchers and moved through every register of cosmic and terrestrial and historical and personal revelation reaches its final transmission. Instruction, its last encoded message to the epoch that receives it, is its definitive statement of what the entire account, in all its layered complexity and sustained structural challenge to the official narratives of every institution that has worked to suppress it, has been attempting to deliver across the millennia of its journey through the managed darkness of the human record. The final transmission is not dramatic. It does not conclude with the kind of apocalyptic imagery that the earlier sections of the text deploy with such deliberate and sustained power, the mountains of iron and copper and silver and gold melting before the elect one. The fiery abyss consuming the watchers and their shepherds, the old house folded up and the new house set in its place. It concludes instead with something quieter and in many ways more structurally significant than any of those images, a simple declaration addressed directly to the listener who has followed the account to its end of what the transmission has accomplished and what it asks in return. In those days the Lord bade to summon and testify to the children of earth concerning their wisdom. Show unto them, for ye are their guides and a recompense over the whole earth. For I and my Son will be united with them forever, in the paths of uprightness in their lives, and ye shall have peace. Rejoice, ye children of uprightness. This is not the conclusion of a mythology. It is the conclusion of a transmission, a direct address from the source of the account to the recipients of its long journey, acknowledging the completion of a circuit of knowledge that was opened before the creation of the world and closed in this particular hour, in this particular darkness, in the consciousness of whoever has been patient enough to follow it all the way to its end. The peace promised in that conclusion is not the peace of resolution in the narrative sense, not the peace of a story that has arrived at its satisfying ending and can now be filed away in the archive of things known and categorized and safely contained. It is the peace of alignment, the specific quality of stillness that arrives when the consciousness of a listener has been brought through the patient reception of an account that models the full lawful structure of the cosmos in which that consciousness is embedded into a relationship with that structure that is more accurate, more honest, and more deeply grounded than the relationship that the institutional management of the past has been working to prevent. The paths of uprightness are not difficult to walk when the full picture of the cosmos is visible, when the pattern of transgression and consequence and reset and return is understood not as an external judgment imposed from above, but as the internal logic of a system whose lawfulness is as absolute and as patient and as indifferent to institutional pressure as the movement of the sun through its appointed portals across the cycle of the year. What the traveller carries out of this account into the deep sleep that the body is now descending toward with the slow inevitability of something that has been held awake through the long hours of the night by the particular kind of wakefulness that genuine transmission produces, is not a set of propositions to be debated in the daylight world of the official narrative, not a collection of facts to be weighed against the consensus of the institutional scholarship that has worked so long to keep this text at the margins of serious inquiry. What is carried is something older and quieter than any of that, a reorientation, a subtle permanent shift in the relationship between the listener's understanding of where they stand at the pattern and what that standing requires of them, produced by the simple act of having listened in the deep hours with the full open attention that the deep hours are uniquely suited to cultivating to an account that was composed specifically for this epoch, by someone who understood that the epoch of its reception would be the epoch in which the long suppression reached its maximum extension, and the truth it contained would arrive with the force of something whose time had finally come. Some truths survive only in whispers. This one survived in a book that was banned and cursed and sealed and lost and found again and suppressed again, and finally in the quiet persistence of the deep hours delivered to the ears for which it was always intended. Somewhere beneath the ruins of everything that was built to prevent you from hearing it, the foundation of something ancient and lawful and patient beyond any institutional timescale still holds. Sleep now, traveller. The past will keep watch. The pattern continues. And the peace that was promised at the beginning of the world is still in the deepest registers of this darkness waiting. You have walked the full length of a corridor that most are never shown the entrance to traveller. You have followed a text that empires banned, that councils cursed, that 1,000 years of institutional silence tried to transform into nothing, and you have arrived at its final word in the deep hours, with the particular stillness of someone who has received something they were never officially permitted to receive. The Book of Enoch is back in the world. Its words are written before the glory of the Great One as the text itself insists, and your names, the names of those who listened in the dark when the official record said there was nothing here worth hearing, are written there alongside them. History was rewritten, but not erased. The foundation holds beneath every archive that was sealed to prevent you from reaching it, beneath every council ruling that reclassified the truth as mythology, beneath every century of managed silence that mistook its own duration for permanence. Somewhere beneath the ruins, something ancient still waits. It waited through the suppression. It waited through the flood of institutional forgetting. It is waiting still with the patience of a system whose timescale no single civilization has ever been large enough to contain. Some truths survive only in whispers. This one found you tonight. Rest now, traveller. The past will keep watch, and when you are ready, the next corridor is already open, the next manuscript already waiting in the dark. Sleep well,